The snow had been falling for 3 days when Daniel Boone's hunting party found the opening. It was February 1769, deep in what would become eastern Kentucky, and the men were searching for shelter from a blizzard that had turned the mountain pass into a death trap. What they discovered that afternoon would challenge everything European settlers thought they knew about survival in the Appalachian wilderness. The opening was barely visible, concealed behind a natural rock formation and overgrown with laurel thickets. But inside, cut into the limestone mountainside, was a structure that defied explanation. The shelter wasn't a simple cave. Someone had modified the natural formation with such precision that the rock face itself seemed to breathe with the wind, venting smoke without revealing flame, channeling water away from the interior, and most remarkably, standing untouched while the avalanche debris from a century of mountain winters lay scattered across the valley below. Boone would later write in his journal that the structure showed such understanding of the mountain that he felt like a child learning to walk. The Cherokee guide traveling with his party simply nodded. His people had been building these shelters for longer than anyone could remember. What the settlers were only beginning to discover, the indigenous peoples of the Appalachians had perfected across centuries, the art of becoming invisible in the mountains while the mountains protected you in return. This is the story of how Native American engineering created survival structures so sophisticated that modern archaeologists still debate how they were built. It's about knowledge systems that European settlers dismissed as primitive, only to desperately adopt when their own methods failed against Appalachian winters. And it's about the uncomfortable truth that much of what we celebrate as frontier ingenuity was actually indigenous technology, learned through necessity and rarely credited to its true inventors. The Appalachian mountain range stretches over 1,500 miles from Newfoundland to Alabama. But the heart of this story takes place in the central and southern sections, where peaks rise above 6,000 feet, and winter conditions can kill unprepared travelers within hours. These mountains are old, worn down from heights that once rivaled the Rockies. That age created a landscape of complex geology, endless valleys, hidden coves, and most importantly, for shelter building, an abundance of natural caves and rock overhangs formed by millions of years of water erosion through limestone and sandstone. The indigenous peoples of this region, primarily Cherokee, Shawnee, and various Iroquoian groups, had lived in these mountains for at least 12,000 years. By the time European settlers began pushing through the Cumberland Gap in the 1750s and 1760s, Native Americans had developed shelter technologies refined through hundreds of generations of trial and error. The settlers came with European building traditions. Log cabins, which most people associate with the American frontier, were actually introduced by Swedish and Finnish immigrants to the Delaware Valley in the 1630s. The design spread westward as an efficient structure requiring only an axe, readily available timber, and basic carpentry knowledge. But log cabins had a critical weakness in high Appalachian terrain. They were visible for miles, required cleared land, needed constant maintenance against moisture rot, and offered no protection when the mountain itself became the danger. The Native American approach was fundamentally different. Rather than imposing structures onto the landscape, they worked with natural formations, enhancing what the mountain already provided. This wasn't laziness or lack of architectural knowledge. It was sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics, structural engineering, and perhaps most importantly, tactical invisibility. The shelters that most impressed early settlers were the enhanced rock overhangs found throughout the Appalachian Range. Natural rock shelters, formed where erosion created deep overhangs in cliff faces, had been used for millennia. But Native American builders had refined these spaces into year-round habitation sites that could shelter extended families through the harshest conditions. The modifications began with careful examination of water flow. The primary enemy of any mountain shelter is moisture. Rain and snowmelt running off the cliff face above will eventually flood any overhang unless properly managed. Native builders created elaborate drainage systems using precisely placed stones to channel water away from the living space. Archaeological excavations at sites like the Ice House Bottom site in Tennessee have revealed drainage channels cut into bedrock, directing water around the inhabited areas with engineering precision that wouldn't look out of place in modern construction. The smoke management system was perhaps the most ingenious element. Fire was essential for survival in Appalachian winters, where temperatures regularly dropped below zero, and wind chill could be fatal. But smoke from an open fire would either fill the shelter, making it uninhabitable, or pour visibly from the opening, announcing the shelter's location to anyone within miles. Native builders solved this through careful positioning of the fire pit relative to the overhang's natural airflow. By placing fires at specific locations where the cliff face created natural draft, smoke would rise and dissipate through cracks in the rock above or be channeled along the cliff face where it mixed with mist and became invisible from a distance. At the Russell Cave site in Alabama, occupied continuously for over 10,000 years, archaeologists found fire pits positioned with such consistency across millennia that they concluded the placement was based on precise knowledge of the cave's airflow patterns. The structural reinforcement of these shelters demonstrated understanding of geology that surprised later engineers. Where the rock overhang showed signs of instability, builders would strategically place support stones, not as obvious columns that might fail, but as carefully fitted braces that distributed weight through the rock's natural stress lines. At sites in eastern Kentucky, researchers have found rock shelters where indigenous builders reinforced the overhang with stonework so subtle it appears natural until examined closely. These reinforcements allowed families to shelter safely in spaces that would have been considered dangerous without modification. Temperature regulation inside these shelters was achieved through methods that anticipated modern passive solar design. The depth of the overhang, the reflective properties of the rock face, and the strategic placement of wind breaks created microclimates that stayed significantly warmer than outside temperatures. Experiments conducted by archaeologists at recreated Native American rock shelters have shown temperature differences of 20 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit between the interior and exterior during winter conditions, achieved entirely through positioning and natural materials. When Daniel Boone encountered that first shelter in 1769, what struck him most was the sophistication of food storage. The Cherokee builders had created cold storage pits that used the mountain's natural temperature gradient. By digging into the floor of the rock shelter at specific depths, they created storage areas that maintained near-freezing temperatures year-round. Meat could be preserved for months. Roots and dried foods stayed fresh through entire winters. The principle was simple. The Earth's temperature below the frost line remains constant. But the execution required precise knowledge of local geology and careful excavation that didn't compromise the shelter's structural integrity. The avalanche protection these shelters provided was not accidental. The Appalachian Mountains see regular avalanche activity, particularly in the higher elevations where snow load on steep slopes creates deadly slides. Native builders chose shelter locations with clear understanding of avalanche paths. Rock overhangs used for winter habitation were invariably positioned on the upslope side of natural barriers, large rock formations or ridges that would deflect avalanche debris. At sites where this wasn't naturally available, builders would construct rock walls on the downslope side of the shelter, not as obvious defensive barriers, but as deflection structures that would guide snow and debris around the inhabited space. Archaeological evidence from sites like the Panther Cave in Virginia shows avalanche debris layers dating back centuries, with the rock shelter itself remaining clear. The native builders had positioned the shelter so that the natural rock formation above created a protective pocket. When avalanches occurred, the debris split around the shelter site and rejoined below, leaving the inhabited area untouched. This wasn't luck. It was engineering based on observation of natural patterns across generations. The hidden nature of these shelters gave Native Americans enormous tactical advantages. When warfare broke out between indigenous groups and European settlers in the 1770s and 1780s, Native American fighters could vanish into the mountains in ways that frustrated colonial militias. What settlers didn't realize was that they were often within yards of occupied shelters without seeing them. The entrances were concealed behind natural vegetation that was encouraged to grow rather than cleared. Approach paths followed natural terrain features that left no obvious trails. Smoke from fires dissipated invisibly, and the shelters themselves were positioned where the rock formations created blind spots from common travel routes. During Pontiac's War in 1763, 1766, and later during the Cherokee Wars of the 1770s, colonial forces repeatedly found themselves unable to locate Native American groups they knew were in specific mountain regions. After one frustrating search in what is now West Virginia, a British officer wrote that the Indians must possess magic to disappear so completely. They didn't possess magic. They possessed centuries of knowledge about how to live within the landscape rather than on top of it. The transfer of this knowledge to European settlers happened gradually and often, without acknowledgement. When the American Revolution disrupted supply lines and settlers found themselves cut off from Eastern resources, they had no choice but to adopt Native American techniques. Long hunters, men who spent months in the wilderness hunting and trapping, began using and modifying rock shelters they found. Some of these men, like Simon Kenton and Benjamin Logan, spent time as captives of Native American groups and learned shelter construction techniques directly, though they rarely credited their indigenous teachers. The Great Cold Season of 1779 to 1780, one of the harshest winters in recorded American history, killed dozens of settlers in poorly constructed cabins. Meanwhile, Native American groups and the handful of settlers who had adopted their shelter techniques survived with far fewer losses. The lesson was clear, but pride and prejudice made it difficult for many settlers to admit that the savage Indians they looked down upon were actually superior engineers for this specific environment. By the 1790s, as settlement pressure increased and Native American populations were displaced westward, European settlers began systematically occupying and modifying the rock shelters they found. Many of these shelters became the first permanent habitation sites in remote mountain valleys. Families would live in the rock shelter while building a cabin nearby, then continue using the shelter for storage, smokehouse operations, or emergency refuge during severe weather. The sophistication of water management in these shelters became apparent when settlers tried to occupy them without understanding the indigenous engineering. At one site in what is now Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a settler family moved into a large rock shelter in 1802. They blocked several of the drainage channels to level the floor for easier living. That spring, runoff from snowmelt flooded the shelter, destroying their supplies and forcing evacuation. The family spent a summer studying how water flowed through the site, eventually recreating the drainage system they had ignorantly destroyed. The pattern repeated across the region. Settlers who respected the existing shelter modifications thrived. Those who assumed they could improve on primitive construction learned painful lessons. The thermal efficiency of properly positioned rock shelters made them valuable for operations beyond simple habitation. Settlers discovered that the consistent cool temperatures made them perfect for fermenting whiskey, a major economic product in the early Appalachian economy. Many rock shelters became small-scale distilleries, with the natural temperature control producing whiskey of higher quality than could be achieved in above-ground structures. This economic use helped preserve many shelters that might otherwise have been abandoned as families moved into more conventional homes. The concealed nature of rock shelter distilleries also proved valuable when the federal government began taxing whiskey production in 1791. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 was largely centered in western Pennsylvania, but resistance to federal taxation of small-scale distilling continued throughout the Appalachian region for decades. Rock shelter distilleries were nearly impossible for revenue agents to locate, continuing a tradition of invisibility that had begun with indigenous builders centuries earlier. The architectural principles of Appalachian rock shelters influenced the development of what became known as mountain cabin design. Settlers who understood the advantages of working with natural landforms began building cabins partially dug into hillsides with earth berms on 3 sides and the front facing south for solar heating. This design, which became common in remote mountain homesteads, was essentially a translation of rock shelter principles into log construction. The thermal mass of the earth surrounding 3 sides moderated temperature swings. The positioning minimized visibility from below, and the reduced exposure to wind decreased fuel requirements for heating. The tactical uses of concealed shelters continued long after the Indian Wars ended. During the Civil War, both Union and Confederate forces used Appalachian rock shelters for hidden supply depots and refugee stations along smuggling routes. Local guides who knew the shelter locations commanded high prices from both sides. In eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina, where loyalties were divided and violence was common, families used rock shelters as emergency refuges during raids. The same features that had protected Native Americans from colonial militias now protected mountain families from guerrilla warfare. The knowledge systems that created these sophisticated shelters were oral traditions passed through generations. Native American peoples of the Appalachians did not use written language in the European sense, leading many settlers to assume they lacked sophisticated knowledge. This was a profound misunderstanding. Oral traditions can preserve technical knowledge with remarkable accuracy when teaching methods emphasize practical demonstration and careful observation. Young Cherokee or Shawnee individuals learning shelter construction would spend seasons working with experienced builders, learning to read the rock face for stress lines, to observe water flow patterns through full seasonal cycles, and to understand how smoke behaves in different wind conditions. This hands-on education produced experts with intuitive understanding of principles that European engineers wouldn't formalize until much later. The displacement of Native American populations from the Appalachian region between 1790 and 1840 represents an enormous loss of accumulated knowledge. While some shelter-building techniques were adopted by settlers, much of the deeper understanding was lost. Modern archaeologists working in Appalachian rock shelters sometimes encounter engineering features whose purpose isn't immediately obvious. Carefully placed stones, specific arrangements of fire pits, or modification of the rock face that doesn't seem necessary for basic shelter. These may represent sophisticated solutions to specific environmental challenges, but without the oral tradition to explain them, their purpose remains mysterious. The archaeological study of Appalachian rock shelters has accelerated in recent decades, revealing the full extent of indigenous modification. At sites like the Dust Cave in Alabama and the St. Albans site in West Virginia, researchers have documented occupation layers spanning 10,000 years. These sites show continuous refinement of shelter techniques, with each generation making small improvements that accumulated into the sophisticated structures that amazed early settlers. Modern engineering analysis of these sites has confirmed what Native American oral traditions always maintained. The builders possess sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics, thermodynamics, and hydrology. The drainage systems move water with efficiency that matches modern civil engineering standards. The structural reinforcements distribute loads through natural stress patterns in ways that weren't formalized in Western engineering until the 20th century. And the passive thermal regulation achieves temperature control that contemporary sustainable architecture struggles to match. The question of why this knowledge wasn't more widely recognized or credited has uncomfortable answers rooted in colonial attitudes. European settlers operated under assumptions of cultural superiority that made it difficult to acknowledge indigenous engineering excellence. When settlers adopted Native American techniques, they often reframed them as common-sense discoveries rather than learned knowledge. The cognitive dissonance of simultaneously dismissing Native Americans as primitive while depending on their technologies was resolved by simply not acknowledging the source. This pattern extended beyond shelter construction. Native American agricultural techniques, medicinal knowledge, and forest management practices were all adopted by settlers while credit was withheld. The myth of the self-sufficient frontier settler overcoming wilderness through European ingenuity requires ignoring the enormous debt owed to indigenous knowledge systems. The survival of some Native American shelter-building traditions into the 21st century is largely due to isolated mountain communities that preserve techniques out of necessity rather than historical interest. In remote valleys of eastern Kentucky and western North Carolina, families continued using enhanced rock shelters for specific purposes: root cellars, spring houses, and smokehouses. These practical uses kept alive knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The revival of interest in traditional shelter techniques has been driven partly by the sustainable architecture movement. Modern designers looking to create energy-efficient structures that work with natural systems have rediscovered many principles that indigenous Appalachian builders understood intuitively. Passive solar design, thermal mass for temperature regulation, and careful site selection for natural advantages are all now taught in architectural schools as innovations, despite being fundamental principles of Native American shelter construction for centuries. The historical irony is profound. Technologies dismissed as primitive in the 18th century are now celebrated as advanced sustainable design in the 21st century. The same approach that European settlers once mocked, living within the landscape rather than imposing structures upon it, is now recognized as the future of environmentally responsible architecture. For historians and archaeologists working to understand the full scope of Native American engineering in the Appalachians, each shelter site presents new evidence of sophisticated knowledge systems. Recent studies using ground-penetrating radar have revealed that some sites considered natural caves actually show evidence of extensive human modification. The rock face itself may have been worked to improve structural stability or alter water flow. These modifications were done so skillfully that they appear natural without detailed analysis. The educational implications are significant. American history has traditionally presented westward expansion as a story of European settlers bringing civilization to wilderness. The reality, documented in sites throughout the Appalachians, is that settlers entered a landscape that had been actively managed and engineered by human populations for millennia. The appearance of untouched wilderness was itself partly the result of sophisticated indigenous land management that maintained forest health while providing resources. When we examine specific examples of Native American shelters that amazed early settlers, the Blowing Rock Cave in North Carolina stands out. European settlers found this site in 1784 and were astounded by its features. The cave entrance was positioned so that prevailing winds created constant ventilation without direct drafts in the inhabited areas. Natural chambers within the cave system had been modified for specific purposes. A cold storage chamber that stayed below 40 degrees year-round, a cooking area with smoke vents carved through the rock ceiling, and sleeping chambers positioned for maximum warmth from a central fire. The drainage system kept the cave completely dry, despite being in a region with over 60 inches of annual rainfall. What the settlers initially assumed was entirely natural was revealed upon closer examination to be heavily engineered. The smoke vents had been gradually enlarged through controlled heating and cooling of the rock, a process that must have taken years. The drainage channels were lined with carefully fitted stones that directed water without obvious human construction. And the sleeping chambers had been positioned after careful observation of how heat from the central fire flowed through the cave system. The family that first occupied Blowing Rock Cave after Native American displacement lived there for 23 years before building a cabin. They later wrote that the cave was more comfortable and required far less maintenance than any house they subsequently built. This wasn't isolated sentiment. Throughout the Appalachians, settlers who learned to properly use enhanced rock shelters found them superior to conventional structures for many purposes. The techniques for concealing shelter entrances deserve special attention. Native American builders used living plants as construction materials in ways that European settlers initially didn't understand. Rhododendron and mountain laurel, which grow thick in Appalachian forests, were encouraged to grow in specific patterns around shelter entrances. These evergreen shrubs provided concealment year-round, while their growth patterns appeared entirely natural. The builders understood which species would thrive in different exposures and soils, essentially cultivating camouflage that required no maintenance beyond initial establishment. When settlers first began searching for these shelters, they often walked within feet of entrances without seeing them. The natural appearance of the laurel thickets didn't register as constructed barriers. Only after Native American guides showed them how to read subtle signs, the pattern of growth, the slight path worn by careful use, the positioning relative to water sources, did settlers learn to find the concealed shelters. The strategic importance of this concealment extended beyond mere hiding. In warfare, information about enemy positions is crucial. Native American groups could move through regions, shelter in multiple locations, and remain undetected because their infrastructure was invisible to European eyes. Colonial military commanders, frustrated by their inability to locate Native American encampments, were facing an intelligence problem they couldn't solve with European military doctrine. The long-term durability of these structures is remarkable. Archaeological sites show some rock shelters were continuously occupied for thousands of years. The modifications made in 1000 BC were still functional in 1000 AD, and many remained functional when European settlers arrived in the 1700s. This isn't because the structures were maintenance-free. Evidence shows regular upkeep and modification. But the fundamental design was so sound that it could be maintained with minimal effort across centuries. Modern preservation efforts face challenges in protecting Appalachian rock shelter sites. Many are on private property used for storage or recreational purposes without awareness of their archaeological significance. Others are threatened by development pressure as remote mountain regions become more accessible. And some have been damaged by well-intentioned but misguided restoration efforts that don't understand the original engineering principles. Organizations working to document and preserve these sites emphasize the need to involve descendants of the indigenous builders. Cherokee, Shawnee, and other tribes displaced from the Appalachians maintain oral traditions about shelter construction techniques. Collaboration between archaeologists and indigenous knowledge keepers has revealed features and purposes that weren't apparent through archaeological methods alone. The broader lesson from Appalachian rock shelter history is about recognizing knowledge in forms that don't match our expectations. European settlers expected sophisticated engineering to look like European engineering. Buildings with right angles, visible construction, and formal design. When they encountered engineering that worked with natural forms, that was deliberately invisible, and that relied on deep observation of natural systems rather than imposed order, they often failed to recognize it as engineering at all. This blindness had real costs. Settlers who assumed they understood mountain survival better than the Native Americans they displaced often paid with their lives. Those who had the humility to learn from indigenous techniques, whether through direct teaching or observation of existing structures, significantly improved their survival odds. The frontier experience was, in many ways, a forced education in which European technological arrogance met environmental reality. For the modern reader, the story of Appalachian rock shelters offers perspective on how knowledge is valued and preserved. The techniques that allowed Native American peoples to thrive in harsh mountain environments were dismissed as primitive by people who couldn't survive their first winter without adopting those same techniques. The comfortable cabins and thriving settlements of later generations were built on foundations of indigenous knowledge that was rarely acknowledged and is now largely forgotten. When we hike through the Appalachian Mountains today, we pass rock overhangs and cave entrances without recognizing them as the sophisticated structures they are. What looks like a simple natural cave may actually be an engineered space where families lived comfortably through winters that would challenge modern camping equipment. What appears to be random stone placement may be a drainage system designed with precision that matches contemporary civil engineering. And what seems like pristine wilderness may actually be a managed landscape shaped by thousands of years of careful human interaction. The Cherokee guide who showed Daniel Boone that shelter in 1769 was sharing knowledge from a tradition older than European presence in the Americas. Boone's reaction, feeling like a child learning to walk, was appropriate. He was encountering a knowledge system he hadn't known existed, one that would shape his own legendary survival skills in ways he rarely credited to its source. The hidden shelters of the Appalachian Mountains stand as monuments to human ingenuity working in harmony with natural systems. They represent centuries of observation, experimentation, and refinement. They demonstrate that sophistication isn't about imposing human will on nature, but about understanding natural systems deeply enough to work within them. And they remind us that knowledge takes many forms, preserved through oral traditions and practical demonstration as effectively as through written texts and formal education. The Native American builders who created these structures left a legacy that extends far beyond the physical shelters themselves. They demonstrated approaches to living in challenging environments that remain relevant as we face questions about sustainable development and environmental responsibility. Their techniques, refined across generations of careful observation, offer lessons we're still learning to appreciate fully. The Appalachian rock shelters that survived avalanches, sheltered families through brutal winters, and remained invisible to those who didn't know how to see them, were never simple refuges. They were sophisticated engineering achievements, products of cultural knowledge systems that understood the mountains with intimacy born of millennia. That knowledge was nearly lost through displacement and cultural dismissal. What survives in archaeological sites and fading oral traditions deserves recognition not as primitive shelter, but as the advanced architecture it always was.